Hello and welcome to the beginning of Wisdom Live. I'm Andrew Schumacher. I hope that you're having a wonderful evening. I have been trying to get this thing going. It's been a while and I'm learning some new things. And yeah, hopefully things are up and running as they should be now. And I'm going to let people, I started it and had to stop it. And now I'm restarting it and uh, hopefully people find it. Anyway, this is going to be, as the title talks about, there's going to be a look at Hebrews chapter 9. This is deep dive number 7 in the Hebrews series. It will be in the playlist. I've got a playlist with all the other parts on the YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. And in the meantime, I'm going to get this thing going. And in addition to talking about Hebrews, we're going to also be responding to Tim Hegg's commentary on the book of Hebrews. Now, Tim is a scholar. He knows the original languages. He is very, very competent in them. And I am expecting that, I'll find the best arguments I can for the Torah observance position in out of the book of regarding the book of Hebrews from his commentary. In fact, if you caught a few episodes ago, when I first introduced his commentary, we looked at the introduction and we looked at the fact that he wrote the commentary because he wanted to talk about Torah observance theology and how to interpret Hebrews in light of that. So he's no slouch. Most people from all over the differing belief systems within the Torah movements, a lot of them do cite Tim Hegg as an authority. And so I'm glad to be able to go through this commentary while also basically just providing commentary on the book of Hebrews. So I'm excited to do that with you. Now, one thing I wanted to do before I jumped into the actual book is to talk a little bit about what is a motivator for me in terms of looking at someone like Tim Hegg's work. I consider that to be among the best stuff that's out there. Now, in my opinion, there's while there are many different folks and a lot of different sort of fringe beliefs, and we've talked about some of those in the past a little bit. When it comes to the Torah movements, the core of the movement is Torah observance theology. And that's what they all have in common. And that's really, if you look at it properly, it's what's behind a lot of the other more fringe elements of what they believe. Um, those who reject the Trinity, for example, again, not all of them, but those who do cite basically the same kind of motivations for why they believe we should be Torah observant, that the church has gone astray and should go back to what the Bible says, and they think that denying the Trinity is doing that as well. So it's often the same motivation. Um, but what I'm going to be, but I wanted to share something to really give you an idea of what I deal with when I'm looking at these things, and so you have an idea kind of where I'm coming from here. Let me show you something here. So recently, on the show Cultish, which I was a guest on a couple of times, they had R.L. Solberg as a guest. He recently put out a book on the book of Galatians, and it's sort of a commentary, but again, talking about all the different stuff related to Torah movements and things like that. And so he had an interview just this past week, and in a Facebook group that I'm in, I saw them talking about it, and I wanted to bring this up and talk with you about it a little bit because I think it's an example of kind of what I deal with and what motivates me to do this kind of a show. So I'm going to bring this down and show you guys what was said. So this is an original post in the group. It says, "Can anyone here think of an occasion?" Now, again, this is Cultish had R.L. Solberg on, so that's what he's commenting on. "Can anyone here think of an occasion where one of these podcasts or videos have brought on an objective voice to speak on pronomianism slash messianicism?" Um, Maybe a new word or something. I will point something out in this first question that's kind of an issue. Is objective. There's no such thing as objective. um, we all have a position. We all have things we believe, and we don't all have things we believe. We don't all believe strongly about the same things. So there are people out there who don't really care if Torah observance theology or the traditional Christian view of the law and how we relate to it. They don't care if that's true. I mean, a lot of non-Christians don't really care, right? But that's not the same thing as to say they're objective. What he's asking for is, an actual Torah observant person to go on these shows. And whenever I was on there, they said the same thing. And they said if it's like as if there's something wrong with two people, online discussing something where they both believe pretty much the same things, but maybe one is more knowledgeable than the other, and that's why you're having the interview. It doesn't always have to be like a debate in both sides and all that kind of stuff, but those things do happen. But I just think it's funny he says objective because yeah, that's never going to happen. But let's keep going. This gets interesting. It says this podcast has had Schumacher spelling. Is the spelling right? No, you missed the first C. But had Schumacher and now Solberg on to speak on the larger field of belief. Two people who quite literally build their social media platforms on antinomianism. Um, so right there we have a ninth commandment violation. Alert, alert. Ninth commandment is thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. And that's what just happened there. Um, in two ways. There are two ways in which this is a false witness. Number one is that I'll start at the end there. This term antinomianism within this group, especially this particular group that you know likes to use the label of pronomian. Generally, the people using that label within the Torah movements are the most orthodox in terms of their other beliefs. They are usually Trinitarian and believe in sola fide and those kinds of things. But you'll notice, they like to use this term antinomianism for basically anyone who's not Torah observant. And now that is a term. Antinomianism is an old term that is a theological concept that goes back much farther than the Torah movements. And it doesn't mean what he's saying. It doesn't mean someone like me who loves the law of God but thinks that the Torah movements are twisting scripture and teaching it incorrectly. What it means is someone who absolutely disregards the law of God, absolutely thinks there's nothing we have to obey. We can just do whatever we want, and God will forgive us no matter what, and we don't. It doesn't that there's no relation between our faith and what we do, and that what we do doesn't need to conform to the image of Christ in any regard. That's what antinomianism means. Look it up in any dictionary. That's what it means. These guys have a very specific definition they use for themselves, but they also impose it on everyone else. So the fact that he's saying that I'm building a platform on antinomianism is a lie. It is false. He's using an incorrect definition of that word, but also the second way that it's sort of a false bearing false witness is it's talking about building a platform as if there's something wrong with that, as if the people that he likes didn't also build a platform on what they believe. So yeah, that's not a sin. There's no commandment in the Torah that says anything about you shouldn't build platforms based on what you believe or anything like that. But let's continue. He says, It kind of illustrates the difference here. I'm not sure what difference he's referring to, but the difference is here. One of the best pieces of advice I received in seminary, so apparently he's been to seminary, was when developing and then arguing a thesis, you objectively consult every person who holds the view opposite of your own. Well, let me stop there. Every person? Really? So, I mean, he never consulted me before he made this post. So he didn't consult every person, and that's just plain ridiculous. You can't consult every person who holds a view different than your own. That's just a preposterous statement. Um, he goes on to say, and you ensure that you're always fairly and accurately representing not just who you consult, but the entire group of voices who have similar or synonymous views. I mean, that's just an absolutely impossible thing. You can't know what everyone believes who kind of believes similarly to those things. And um, but you can fairly represent those that you do know. And that's exactly what I have attempted to do throughout my work on in these areas. So, yeah, I think that it is just a little bit silly what he's saying here, and yeah, we'll call it that. And I apologize if I get uh, distracted or seem like I'm working on something else. It's because I often am. I just want to make sure that everything's working on this stream. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so um, but then let's continue. He says, "I'm really curious if a larger platform, and I assume he means like cultish or something like that, has actually brought on a messianic slash pronomian instead of using boogeyman and strawmans, or handpicking the most misrepresenting and embarrassing characters on the internet." And again, this is absolute slander. This is not none of this is true. He's saying, "Oh yeah, just they're using straw man." He's not giving any examples. That is a Deuteronomy 19 violation, which says that you don't bring accusations without witnesses. So if you're going to say, "Oh, these guys are presenting a straw man," give me an example. Give me an example of a straw man argument that I've made. If you want to make that accusation that I'm misrepresenting and I'm just such an embarrassing character for misrepresenting what people in the Torah movements believe, well, by all means, demonstrate it. Show, quote me where I've said what they believe, and show me how I'm wrong. Show me that they don't believe that, or that none of them believe that. Because again, I've never claimed that everyone believes everything that I'm bringing up. And then I had another one here. This is a comment within that same post, and I wanted to interact with this as well, since it also mentioned me. It says, and this one again is it's kind of more of the same, but it says, "I've watched the coverage of the quote Hebrew roots movement from Cultish, Ali Beth Stuckey, The Beginning of Wisdom, Theology Mom, haven't heard of her, and Mike Winger. One of the main issues is that many of them only seem familiar with surface level or second-hand information, which leads to lumping everyone together and dismissing pronomianism entirely. In reality, there's a broad spectrum and different and significant nuance within the movement." Okay, let's deal with that first. So I don't know how you would label something surface level. I don't I don't think dealing with Tim Hegg's commentary, which I've been doing for many, many months, is surface level, and it certainly isn't secondhand either. Um, I I respond directly to the people who are out there teaching Torah observance. I responded to Messiah Matters and 119 Ministries, um, Lex Meyer, David Wilbur, all these guys. I've taken what they've produced, Sean Griffin, all these guys who are promoting this. I've looked directly at what they say from the horse's mouth. I mean, there's not anyone like if those are secondary sources, I don't know what primary sources are. But they're out there teaching these things, and I'm addressing them directly. So this is again just another lie, just another way of trying to slander and say that I'm doing something I'm not doing. But and again, lumping everyone together. Really, this that statement alone is proof positive that that first statement is not true, that this person has watched the coverage. No, you haven't. You have, maybe, I'm guessing because of how inaccurate this statement is. Maybe you've watched what secondary sources, people within the Torah movements, have said about those of us who've argued against it. Um, but no, you haven't watched the primary sources, because multiple times, in every single time that I appeared on Cultish, I made the statement that I'm not lumping everyone together. There are lots of different beliefs. Um, and when it came to, different types of beliefs within the movement, I made it very, very clear. Not everyone believes this. Not everyone believes this. So it's obvious from this comment that this person, she has not watched what she's claiming she has. She says, in reality, there's a broad spectrum. Yeah, and I've acknowledged that. She says, it goes on, unfortunately, fringe beliefs such as works-based salvation, denial of the Trinity, speculative eschatology, or even flat earth theories are often assumed to represent the whole. I've never done it. I don't think Mike Winger's ever done it. I don't think the cultish guys have ever done it. I know that Rob Solberg has never done it. I'm pretty sure Ali Beth Stuckey hasn't really said anything. She interviewed the cultish guys. So it's not like she's said anything really. Um, this is just again, this is just not true, not true, just wanting to try to slander people. This mischaracterization that never happens fuels misunderstanding and prevents charitable, thoughtful discourse. I've reached out to some of these commentators. Not me, as far as I know. I mean, I could have forgotten. Maybe she put a comment on a video once. I don't know. But she's suggesting interviewing individuals within the pronomian movement who can represent a more balanced perspective. Someone like Joshua Ensley, who is more level headed and biblically grounded, would be an excellent choice for that kind of conversation. Well, I'm guessing, because of which group this is, that she probably thinks Caleb Hegg is probably pretty solid and biblically grounded, level headed. I think he is. I disagree with him in this movement, but I've several times interviewed him, and he's interviewed me. Apparently, she doesn't know that. And as far as Joshua Ensley, he's my Facebook friend. And when I have gone after people within the Torah movements who do deny the Trinity, Joshua is one of the first people to pipe in support of what I'm saying. He's come to my defense on those kinds of issues, where he's trying to police the people in his own movement who are engage, believe in all these fringe things. I like Joshua a lot, but and I would be willing to talk to him too. I've never reached out to ask him to, and honestly, the main reason is I don't see him actively, heavily engaged in apologetics for his Torah observance beliefs. He pastors a church. He says things in support of what he believes, but I don't see him out there going after the traditional Christians the way that a lot do, and trying to show how we're wrong. And so I respectfully have just not really uh, sought to engage him directly and publicly on these issues. I'd like to at some point, but I just really haven't. But I have engaged Caleb Haig, and I've, like I said before, I've in videos and things responded to many people who are not secondary sources when it comes to these things. So I wanted to share that with you again, to just give you a little bit of the backdrop and show that, yeah, there's a lot out there where people are saying all kinds of things. But here, my goal, what I'm seeking to do, is really go to the text, go to the specific arguments that are being made, and go to the about the text, and go to the text and say, do these match up? Does this work, or does this not work? Um, you know, one comment about the surface level thing, where oh they're just dealing with surface level stuff. Um, One thing that I just finished producing recently is my Torah Under Christ series. It's a trilogy of videos that's 5.5 hours of content, and it is not surface level. It is going deep into the text of Scripture and deep into the arguments that that people in the Torah movements are making to answer them directly to the best of my ability. And I'm sorry, that's out there. And if someone wants to say that I'm you know, doing something that I'm not doing it. They're just displaying their own ignorance is what they're doing. And I do hope I mean, like I said, I'm not into comment battles on Facebook. So I'm not gonna go to war in the Facebook comments. But I do hope that, someone points this episode out to her and and the gentleman who did the original post, just to say, hey guys, you're sitting there on the sidelines saying a bunch of stuff that isn't true. How about actually trying to engage with what's out there? How about you deal with some primary sources and deal with the answers to your arguments, because they're there and they're not hard to find. All right. So that being said, let me kind of check how things are going. See how you guys are doing on the chat. Everybody happy? I can see a few people. I see Lois. I see Gloria, I see um, Happy. Good to see you guys in there. Um, and I am just about ready to jump right here into Hebrews. Hope you guys are doing well. And yeah, let's do this thing. So, all right. So let me bring this up, and we will see how it goes. All right, everything looks good. So to give you a little background, like I said, this is part 7 of this series, so it is not, we're deep into Hebrews now. Really from Hebrews 8, where it starts heavily talking about the new covenant and the old being obsolete, and all that kind of stuff that's in there. I should say the first covenant being obsolete, because that's the language that Hebrews uses. Um, that's where I began to really engage with Tim Hegg's commentary. So I that's if you want to hear that stuff, I'd highly recommend that. But today I'm jumping into what we have here in Hebrews 9:11 to 28. There's some really, really good stuff in this chapter and this second half of this chapter. And we get into Hebrews 10 next time, which, man, I'm really looking forward to that. All right. So let's get going. So the first part of this is going to basically just be going through the text, getting an idea what's in here, and then we'll begin to interact with some things in Tim Haig's commentary, including part that's not specifically about this text, but is about the new covenant and what this text is about. Let's go. So again, this is part 7. The talking about the second half of chapter 9. In the section, we're this chapter falls within a section of Hebrews that's really all about the differences between Old and New covenants. Chapter 7 through 10 is all about that, and so that's where we're at. So let's go ahead and read the section, and then we'll get into the commentary here. So it says, "But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy places once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the trespasses that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in force while the one who made it lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." And in the same way, both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry he sprinkled with the blood. And according to the law, one may also say things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of things in the heavens to be cleansed with these. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter holy places made with hands, mere copies of the true ones, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often, as the high priest enters the holy places year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the condemnation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. All right. So let's kind of start at the beginning and work our way through. So in verse 11 was, if you were here for the last one, which was a number of months ago, but verse 11, even though it was not part of what we were looking at last time when we looked at Tim Hegg's commentary on verse 10, most of it was actually about verse 11. So let's talk about this a little bit. It says, Jesus appeared as our high priest of the, quote, good things to come, namely of redemption through his sacrifice and the inauguration of the new covenant. That's what's being referred to there by good things to come. And we can know this a couple ways. He entered the greater tabernacle, the heavenly one. And as we saw last time when Tim Hegg talked about this verse, he favored a futuristic reading of it. So Tim Hegg, if you remember, he favored a reading that said the good things to come in the future, as in he's the high priest of what hasn't happened yet, and even at the time of the writing of Hebrews hadn't happened yet, and still hasn't happened yet for us. It's the consummation of all things is how he wanted to read it. Um, Now he favored that reading for obvious reasons, but his as we saw last time, his interpretation was not possible for a couple of reasons. Number one, just the text, the most likely older reading in the Greek is good things that have come. Now, the translation I chose says good things to come, and that's partly because I don't think it matters. Um, it, if we say good things to come, it's more ambiguous actually. It could refer to either thing, but really the textual evidence is on the side of good things that have come, that he is talking about past tense. Um, but even if he's talking about future tense in a sense, he's talking about something Christ did before that. He appeared as a high priest of the good things to come. That is the inauguration of the new covenant. He came to do that. So the good things were still to come when Christ first appeared. So that's why I say it's kind of ambiguous. Even if it is future tense, it's not necessarily our future tense. It may have been Jesus's, but again, I think the past tense reading is better. But um, this is also a parallel to Hebrews 10:1. Hebrews 10:1 also talks about things to come, and I think that it's actually got it's an interesting thing. So let me go ahead and actually pull that up. I want to, and I'll do it so y'all can see it too. Um, let's see. I'm gonna do. That's fine. Hebrews 10. Okay, got it there. And then let me go ahead and bring that up. And I probably need, yeah, I need to grab it. And do, there it is. Okay. So here it says in Hebrews 10:1, it says, "For the law, since it is only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make perfect those who draw near." So, what's it talking about? The shadow is the sacrifices. What is the substance? What is the good things to come? The sacrifice of Christ. So Hebrews 10:1 is in the future tense, good things to come, but it's about the sacrifice of Christ. It's talking from the perspective of the law in the past that it was looking forward to Christ. And so if we want to, and Tim Hegg does this, and we saw this last time, he wants to take this this view that based on what's being said here about in 9:11 in Hebrews 9:11 that, oh well, it's parallel to 10:1, so therefore it should be the same reading. Maybe there's a good argument that the reason that we have that reading twice is scribal error, that they saw a parallel that wasn't really there. But even again, even if it's about future, 10:1 is about the sacrifice of Christ. 10:1 is about the work of Christ inaugurating the new covenant. It's not about the consummation of all things. So if that is a parallel, then this is also about the inauguration of the new covenant, just like Hebrews 10:1. So continuing on, and we will go to the next verse. Verse 12, "And not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, he entered the holy places once for all, having obtained eternal redemption." So here we see the distinction, but there is a parallel with the animal sacrifices. Jesus did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. And these arguments refute another Torah movement teacher, Sean Griffin, who insists on rejecting Jesus' death as a true sacrifice for our sins in order to make room for Jesus to continue to do animal sacrifices. So his view, and this is a fringe one, I don't know of anyone else who believes what Sean teaches on this other than the people who follow him. But like he says that Jesus is in heaven offering blood of goats and calves and all that continually to this day and will continue to do that. And so because he believes that, he tries to downplay anything about Jesus' death being a sacrifice for us. But it says, instead of it, he entered that, he did what he did, his work, not through the blood of goats and calves, but his own blood. And he obtained eternal redemption. We don't need to keep getting redeemed over and over because he did it. He obtained it once for all. And so obviously Hebrews never presents Jesus as continuing to do that. His own death is the offering that he gives. Um, Also, this is one of the many places in Hebrews that we see that once for all, which really means once for all time, once, you know, and done, one and done kind of thing. It is not a repeatable kind of sacrifice. Jesus obtained eternal redemption. So any future sin, if any future sin could render this insufficient, then it would not be eternal redemption. So this goes against any view, and there are many groups out there, outside the Torah movements that hold to a belief that the death of Christ gets you, wipes away all the sins when you repent and get baptized and all that, wipes away all your sins that you had before that event. but then you keep sinning, and so you have to do stuff yourself. Um, and so that view is refuted here when he says, having obtained eternal redemption. Um, there's no going back. All right, verses 13 and 14. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So here we see the contrast between the animal sacrifices and Jesus' sacrifice. And it's a lesser to greater, right? How much more? Um, those sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, serve to cleanse the flesh, but Jesus' sacrifice cleanses the conscience, something the other sacrifices could never do. Um, this is one of those key distinctions brought out between the different types of sacrifices. And notice how it says how much more. So it's not just that it's a distinct offering. I've talked about this in other places. In my conversation with Caleb Hegg on the sacrifices, he argued that the Jesus sacrifice and the other sacrifices can coexist because they're about distinct things. But that's not really what's being said here. It's not saying they're distinct offerings about different things. It's that the one is lesser and the other is greater, and that's what's going on with Jesus' sacrifice. The Jesus sacrifice accomplishes all the animal sacrifices did and more by cleansing the conscience. All right, moving on to verse 15. And for this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the trespasses that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. There's that eternal word again. So eternal redemption, eternal inheritance. But this verse has something very interesting when we're talking about the Torah movements and specifically Tim Hegg's arguments. Um, so first, I want to point out something. We've talked a lot about the word covenant and how it gets inserted in a lot of texts by translators. And I've argued that those are proper insertions. If that's what's being referred to, it's perfectly fine for clarity's sake to insert the word in there. Um, but let's look at this here. So I want to point out that both occurrences of covenant in this verse are there. Neither one is inserted. So you see there it says, for this reason, he's the mediator of a new covenant. That the word covenant is there. And later, when it says the sins that were committed under the first covenant, the word covenant is there both times. Now, this matters. The occurrence of first covenant here establishes a parallel. This is part of the evidence. And we did talk about this verse briefly when we were talking about Hebrews 8:7, where it says it's talking about, for if that first one had been faultless, there would have been no cause for a second. And it's talking about the first covenant. It says, in calling it new, he has declared the first to be old, and what is old is growing, is passing away and is going to disappear. That is about the two covenants, right? But it inserts the word covenant after first in 8:7. So let's just for reminder, let's go ahead and look at that again. So um, in Hebrews 8, let's go back a couple chapters here. Hebrews 8, this is the contentious bit. Verse 7 says, well, let's start with 6. For he has now obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant, and here's where covenant is added, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming when I will complete a new covenant. So the argument Tim Hegg makes in his commentary, and that a lot of Torah observant people make, is that because it's inserted here, it's actually not about the first covenant, but about the first ministry or the first priesthood. That's the argument that they try to make. And again, we went into that in detail in that video. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on it. But Right now, what we're establishing is why, textually speaking, that's not that just isn't the best. We went through lots of reasons why it doesn't work, but here's some reasons why it's not really the best. Here in verse 15, we see the new covenant contrasted with the first covenant, and this time the word covenant is there. This establishes a parallel. This establishes that we have both both of these texts are about the same thing, or it gives heavy evidence of that. And the problem with priesthood or ministry is that there's no such parallel. Nowhere in anywhere in Hebrews is Jesus' priesthood, or the Levitical priesthood rather, referred to as the first priesthood, or the first, Levitical ministry, or whatever. That term first is only ever used in contrast with the new covenant, as in the first covenant versus the new covenant. And this verse does so explicitly. So that's something that's going on here. So it's again further evidence that that argument that the word covenant gets inserted into 8:7 is somehow due to bias is just it doesn't have any legs to stand on. It's not due to bias. It's due to the text itself giving us that indication. So here it says Jesus' death is for the redemption of the trespasses that were committed under the first covenant. Now, this implies a couple of different things. Number one is that his death encompasses the sins of the Sinai covenant. So it's not just something different or separate or distinct, it encompasses whatever is being dealt with in the Sinai covenant, those sins. Jesus' death is for redemption for those. And it says, also notice it says these sins were committed, past tense. There aren't going to be future sins committed under that covenant. Not in the language of Hebrews at this point. Now, it already said that that covenant is passing away. It's growing old, all that kind of stuff. So it's still in operation. I do believe, like most scholars, that Hebrews is written between the death of Christ and the destruction of the temple, in that single 40-year generation, when the Sinai covenant was still operating, but the new covenant had begun. And so the stuff under the Sinai covenant was obsolete, it was growing old, it was passing away, and it would be ultimately destroyed by God when he destroyed the temple in judgment. So the author of Hebrews here is talking about those sins that were committed, not, you know, that first covenant is past tense. He's speaking of it as something that's over. Um, Even though some remnants are continuing at that moment in history, he knows that it's coming to an end. All right, then verse 16 and 17. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in force while the one who made it lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. So here it's talking about a will covenant, as in like a last will and testament kind of covenant. It's using the same word, but as you can see, it's talking about the death of the one who made it. Obviously, God makes covenants and doesn't die in a lot of cases, but here it's being used as an analogy. So he's pointing out that, with this kind of covenant, with the kind of covenant where someone has made a will and made, said, like, these are the things that are going to happen when I die, it's not in force until he dies. And says, therefore, even the first covenant was or not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. He's saying that it was inaugurated with blood in similar way to the how a will requires death. So did the first covenant, and this is one of those texts that does insert the word covenant. But it is obvious. This is one of the ones where they don't really even argue that it's not about the first covenant, because of what it goes on to say in the next verses. Um, there's no zero chance it's about anything else. It's certainly not about the priesthood. It's about the covenant, because it goes on in the next verses. It says this: for when every commandment had been spoken by Moses, what commandments? the commandments for that covenant, to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." So the first covenant was inaugurated with blood, and that's really the only point of bringing up the will stuff, is just to say, look, we understand these covenants required death. The first covenant also required death. In this case, the death of animals. So it's obviously talking about the Sinai covenant, but what it does as well is it stacks up yet another example of this word first, where it doesn't have a direct object, where the covenant is the direct object, where the Sinai covenant specifically is the direct object. So that first covenant, that first, it just keeps happening over and over and over. There's an obvious pattern going on here. No question about that. Says this text also establishes, just like the Abrahamic and New Covenants, the Sinai covenant was ratified and put into effect by the shedding of blood. So, um, again, this is pretty obvious stuff. All right, next verses here. In the same way, both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry he sprinkled with the blood. And according to the law, one may also almost say, all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Um, so Hebrews is perfectly aware of the sacred space ritual purification aspects of sacrifice and blood. So I bring this up because, as again a reminder, um, Tim Heggs and a lot of people in that sort of stream of Torah observance, they they seek to create that space in their theology for there to be animal sacrifices going on at the same time as after Jesus has given his sacrifices, but himself, um, by saying that it's about cleansing sacred space and it's about cleansing the temple and the implements and all that stuff. And that's all certainly true. Um, and this is an example that the author of Hebrews is aware of this. The author of Hebrews is not, you know, just saying stuff and assuming you as the reader, you know, already know it and he doesn't have to talk about it. No, he mentions it. He says the vessels of the ministry he sprinkled with blood. So he's very aware of that aspect of those sacrifices. But he still speaks of forgiveness. Says without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness coming from the shedding of blood, because this is the primary thing being communicated. And again, the main thing about what Jesus did is it brought forgiveness. And the fact is that the temple sacrifices also brought forgiveness. And this is something that a lot of these guys don't really deal with in the Torah movements when they're trying to deal with the sacrifice issue, is they don't deal with the fact that it brought forgiveness of sins. Now that forgiveness is not of the same magnitude and permanence and all that stuff that's going on with Jesus' sacrifice, but they really are about the same thing. It's just one is physical, earthly, temporal, that kind of stuff, and the other one is once for all, you know, for all of his people and all that. So it it's a lesser to greater thing once again when it comes to the different sacrifices. It says therefore it was necessary for the copies of the things in heaven to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter holy places made with hands, mere copies of the true ones, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. So this is the actual relationship between the Torah sacrifices and what Jesus did. The Torah had copies of the sacrifice. They were mere copies of the true sacrifice of Christ. The contrast wasn't physical versus spiritual, as Caleb Hegg talked about in our conversation, but rather the copy versus the real thing that really does the thing that the copy is just kind of doing in a copy way, if that makes sense. So that's the real relationship going on. And then going on verse 25. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy places year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once the consummation of the ages has come or has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So here, you'll notice it's kind of interesting. They talk about the good things to come is the future and the consummation. Well, consummation is here talking about now, or at the time Hebrews was written. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. He's done it. It's done now. And, his sacrifice of himself is of infinite worth and effectiveness so that it does not need to be offered repeatedly like the Levitical high priests offered their sacrifices. By this single sacrifice, Jesus put away sin. He dealt with sin itself. And again, this this contradicts the idea that, oh, well, we're still going to have this temple and we're going to need to do these animal sacrifices to cleanse the temple of what? Of sin? Because Jesus put away sin. He didn't just put away sin in a spiritual way, but not a physical way. He put away sin itself. And we're really going to see that even more when we get to chapter 10. But as it pertains to sacrifice, sin has no effect. Remember, that's the context here. When it says he put away sin, he's talking about sacrifices. It's it's in regards to sacrifice, Jesus has done it. He's finished what needs to be done in regards to sin. All right, last couple verses. And inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. So his death took the place of judgment for those who eagerly await him. Then Jesus, when he comes back a second time, it's without reference to sin pertaining to the context of this section. So what does it mean without reference to sin? So one could argue that when Jesus comes back, he's going to judge sin, right? So isn't he coming back with reference to sin somehow? Well, sure, but what is this text talking about? This text says he's coming back without reference to sin. So in what regard is he coming back without reference to sin? Well, with regards to sacrifice. He doesn't need to come and die for sin again because he did that already. There's no need to deal with unredeemed sin or atoned for sin. He's put it away. He's done it. He will not be performing sacrifices on earth or in heaven past his second coming. The work is finished once for all. All right. So, having gone through the text, now we're going to talk a bit about what Tim Hegg has in his commentary. And he doesn't have a ton that is really that meaningful to the concept of Torah observance and that kind of stuff, or arguing for his case. But we're going to talk a bit about his new covenant stuff as well. But before I get into that, let me just see how people are doing. Take a look at the chat here and see how y'all are doing. So, I see a comment there. Gloria Segundo says, "Do you think that Hebrew roots theology holds that if a person could perfectly obey the Torah, they would be saved?" Uh, Not, I wouldn't say Tim Hegg. I think he would say you can't. But um, that's sort of an individual thing. I think it's not even necessarily related to the Torah movements, but just though it does happen a lot there because they're so focused on that. A lot of times I've read people and heard people who really get so into it. They're like, oh man, I can do all this and I'm gonna keep doing it and it's gonna and they really, some of them do begin to think that they're going to be saved by it. But it's not, and it is as far as be good enough. I mean, those teachers who teach works salvation, which some do. I've talked on the channel about Gary Simon, and he teaches that, and but the way he does is kind of generic. It's not like if you do good enough. It's just your faith and your works work together to bring about salvation is kind of the rough quote from what he said. So it's not just I don't know. I mean, when it comes to works and all that stuff, there's a lot of care that needs to be taken in how those things are expressed. Um, yeah, and yeah, Professor Hive says Hebrew roots theology is not monolithic. It is a wild west, and it doesn't represent most of Torah observance theology. Well, yeah, it's a wild west, and I that's why I mean I haven't really used the term in this entire uh, live stream really of Hebrew roots, and that's because Hebrew roots is one label for the movement that people used to like and then stopped liking, but and it has a lot of things with it in terms of different theological views. I tend to use the word Torah movements, which is a term I got from Caleb Hegg. Actually, he uses that term to describe people within what he thinks is of as the Hebrew roots movement, as well as people who are Torah observant but not part of that movement. Um, he's used that term to talk about all the different people who believe in Torah observance and as a Torah movement. So I'm like, I like that. I'll use that. So that's why I generally just use that type of language. Um, but uh, but yeah, that's kind of how I look at that. So all right, so let's get into Tim Hegg. He's got some things to say about this chapter. All right, so we're gonna examine his commentary. Again, not all of it's super important, but so we want to where we'll start. He said like in most commentaries, he'll say kind of what he thinks is going on in each text. But we've really addressed everything about the first few verses last time, mostly when we talked about 9:10, where he talks so much about 9:11. But verse 15, this is where it says first covenant, right? Where it's actually in the text. And it distinguishes between the new covenant and the first covenant. And that first covenant is the Sinai covenant. So, what does Tim Hegg do with this? Because it clearly undermines his argument about the previous chapter, about chapter 8, where he insists that it's really about the first priesthood. So he has some things to say. So let's go ahead and read some of it. This is from his commentary, quoting Hegg. He is the mediator of a new covenant precisely on the basis of his sacrificial death. He did what no one else could do, namely offer himself as the infinite, eternal, spotless sacrifice. As such, he alone qualifies to mediate the covenant between God and those who he has chosen to save. The quote, first covenant is the Sinai covenant, the Mosaic legislation, for it is the first covenant made with Israel as a nation. Um, so obviously he can't avoid that first covenant means Sinai covenant in this particular text. So he goes ahead and he's not going to try to get around it. Um, at no point does he discuss, and this is the important bit, at no point in this commentary on this section does he discuss the obvious parallel with Hebrews 8:7, which clearly contrasts the same two covenants, but he doesn't give us any kind of scholarly answer to that. He just doesn't talk about it. So as I pointed out, there's no first priesthood. There's no text that talks about the new priesthood and the first priesthood or anything like that, where he could show that parallel. This is an obvious parallel with 8:7, but he doesn't even try. All right. So now I wanted to go into a section earlier in his commentary because it's connected to what we're looking at here. So Um, I just noticed a comment, Professor Hives. Have you seen Hegg's interpretation of Old Covenant, 2 Corinthians? That's what we're about to talk about. We're about to talk about where Hegg puts in writing what he thinks about the New Covenant and the nature of the New Covenant from his Hebrews commentary, and he does so in what's called an excursus. He basically he steps away from verse by verse to talk about a certain concept, and that's what we're going to read about right now. And put to the test. So I'm glad you're here. So It says earlier in the commentary. So this is what I just mentioned. He presents what he believes a new covenant is, and it is a unique take. I'll say that on what the new covenant is. I've never heard anyone else uh, espouse this. So I'm going to bring it up here because obviously it needs to be discussed to make sense of the next citation we'll be discussing in chapter 9. And like with other issues, he has an excursus, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So here's the citation. This is um, kind of the relevant bits from the excursus. He says, "Indeed, God knows and sees all things in the eternal moment of the present. For him, there's no before or after, for he dwells um, in the reality of the non-temporal eternity. Thus, since God's works were, from his perspective, just as finished before time began, as in the course of time, looking at Hebrews 4:3, he forgave those who exercised saving faith before the coming of Messiah in on the basis of the of the sure and finished work of Yeshua, which would take place in the course of world history." Um, so all this is true enough. It basically is just saying God is timeless. Everything he for him is there's nothing new or old to God from his perspective. Um, but I'm not sure. He's not saying what people who hold to various forms of covenant theology, and we'll kind of talk about that, but not much. But what we would mean by God being timeless. But many would say, and I would agree, that eternal salvation was secured by the once for all sacrifice of Christ. And it applies back to those saved before that sacrifice as much as it applies to those of us who came after. So, yes, there's definitely some eternality, some timelessness to all of it. His comments here are meant, as we will see, to put forward his own idiosyncratic view of the new covenant. So he's kind of setting us up for what he's going to try to say the new covenant is, because it's gonna his idea of new and old covenant is going to be um, unique, like like I said. So he can't have the new covenant replace the Sinai covenant. That's the main thing he's trying to avoid here. Despite the clear stuff we've seen in Hebrews 8 and 9, he doesn't want that to happen. So he's going to have a new covenant, a view of the new covenant that differs from that traditional biblical view. The excursus on the new covenant appears in the commentary on Hebrews because Hebrews really is the central location in the whole Bible for a detailed discussion of the new covenant. His treatment is very telling. After discussing the Greek terms and the occurrence of the phrase new covenant, Hegg's next argument takes an interesting turn. So I'm giving you kind of a bird's eye view of what's going on in the excursive without just quoting super long quotes and making you read everything. So basically, he starts by talking about the Greek terms and testamentum and all that stuff, but we kind of move, or diatheke and testament, New Testament, Old Testament, talks about all that kind of stuff. But then he gets into the next argument. This is where things kind of get interesting. It says in Paul's epistles, the contrast between new and old is clearly a contrast between saved and lost, or to use the terms he rather employs, justified and condemned. The old man slash new man contrast, which Paul teaches, looking at Romans 6:6, Ephesians 4:22, Colossians 3:9, is clearly that of faith contrasted with unbelief. Further, we have every reason to believe that our author was familiar with Paul's teaching and that he agreed with it. It should not be a surprise, then, that our author should adopt the same terminology. Thus, when our author juxtaposes new and old, he may well be contrasting that which brings eternal salvation and that which is unable to do so. So, we're going to unpack a lot of this language that Tim Hegg is saying here, and the argument he's trying to put forward. So, we got to ask, okay, is this good Bible study? Is what he's said there good? So let's dig into it. So first of all, he's chosen to talk about how Paul's letters contrast old and new to mean saved and lost, right? Old man, new man, and those texts that he mentioned. Then he speculates that Hebrews is making the same kind of contrast between Old and New Covenant because the author would have been familiar with Paul and may well have utilized the same contrast. He said, he would have agreed with Paul. Well, certainly he would have agreed with Paul. But of course, Hegg is then taking that a further step to saying that the author of Hebrews is using the same new versus old terminology that Paul used about the new and old man, about the old and new covenants. This is Hegg's initial argument. And that I'll say, I wrote this because this is classic Tim Hegg. When you've read enough of what he writes, you start to see this stuff coming. And it starts here with the speculation. So he's really speculating. He's saying, well, maybe the author of Hebrews is using the same ideas of new and old that Paul uses when he's talking about the new and old man. Maybe that's what's going on here. Now, he hasn't given us any evidence of this, but he's speculating. He hasn't offered anything from Hebrews. Remember, like he's talking about Paul's letters here. He's not talking about Hebrews. So he says he's offered us no actual evidence that the author of Hebrews is treating the terms new and old regarding covenants the way Paul did regarding the new man and old man. So far, he's given us only speculation. That's it. The rest of the excursus is about Paul, not Hebrews. Let me make that clear. So Hegg, in his excursus on the new covenant, which comes earlier before he gets to chapter 9, but we're addressing it now. But he steps an excursus. There's like a break there's a break in the flow. He's talking verse by verse by verse, and then there's a break, and he says, let's talk about the new covenant. Let's talk about that now. And then he talks about what the words mean, and then we have this quote about Paul and how the author of Hebrews, maybe he's using the words old and new the same way Paul did when Paul was talking about the old man and new man, about saved and lost. And then the rest of that whole excursus about the new covenant is about stuff in Paul, and it doesn't touch Hebrews again. Never comes back to Hebrews. So the second point that on the screen there right now, it says he's offered zero evidence. He never does. He never comes around to offering us evidence for why we need to read Hebrews the way that Paul writes this stuff about the old man and new man. And this is in his Hebrews commentary. He's talking about he just and remember, the book of Hebrews is the book with the most deep discussion of the new covenant and frequent mention and description of how the new covenant relates to what has come before of anywhere in the whole Bible. And when he takes an excursus to talk about the new covenant as a topic, he doesn't talk about Hebrews. He talks about Paul. That's got to bother you. If you think that, oh yeah, Tim Hegg's got he's got the right idea about how these things fit together. It's got to really bother you that he doesn't actually deal with Hebrews in his Hebrews commentary when he's talking about the new covenant, which is the central theme of the central chapters of the book of Hebrews. It's mind-boggling, really. We're going to keep reading because there's some important stuff here as well. But yeah, let's keep reading. This is back into we're in his excursus section right here. So he says, this leads us to consider the phrase Old Covenant. And again, I'm reading Hegg. Having looked at all the biblical texts which contain the phrase New Covenant, we should consider where the phrase Old Covenant occurs. Judging by how often the phrase Old Covenant is used in Christian theological discussions and literature, we might presume that the phrase Old Covenant would be something which occurs frequently in the apostolic scriptures. But to our surprise, we find it only one time in the whole scripture, 2 Corinthians 3:14. But our minds are hardened, for until this, and he's quoting the verse, says, but their minds were hardened. For until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted because it is removed in Messiah. Here, and then he gives us the actual Greek, if you can read that. So then he says, here Paul refers to the Tanakh as the Old Covenant, for when it is read with a veil covering the glory of Messiah, even as the veil worn by Moses covered the glory shining in his face, the Tanakh is unable to lead the reader to its ultimate goal, which is to reveal the true Messiah and his work of accomplishing salvation for his people. All right. So this is, again, this is a key part of Hegg's argument that when, in 2 Corinthians 3:14, this is the one mention of the Old Covenant in the Bible. It's the one time that particular phrase is used. Now, I would argue that, we saw that in Hebrews 8 when it said, that first covenant, you know, were faultless, if it were without fault, it would not have needed to be replaced, all that stuff. So, and it talks about it growing old and, uses the term old about it. But the but this is the only time that this particular phrase appears in the Bible. That's true. But um there's a lot going on here in what Hegg says. So I want to make a few comments. Um Paul does not here, I will point this out. He does not, contrary to what Tim Hegg just said, refer to the Tanakh as the Old Covenant. So Tanakh is, for those who are not familiar, it's actually an acronym of three Hebrew letters for the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and it's referring to the law, the prophets, and the writings, the threefold, construction of the Old Testament. So when you hear someone, a Jew or someone who likes to use the Hebrew words, say Tanakh, they mean the Old Testament. That's just a modern Jewish way of referring to the Old Testament. It comes from the law, the prophets, and writings, which was around back in during New Testament times. Jesus speaks that way of the Old Testament. But the actual acronym, I'm not sure how old that is, but it certainly is the current modern way of that Jews like to refer to their scriptures, to what we call the Old Testament. So Hegg says Paul is referring to the Tanakh as the Old Covenant, but that's not true. It's actually false, what he claims there. The Tanakh is the whole entire Old Testament, but the next verse, which Hegg didn't cite, says whenever Moses is read. So in 2 Corinthians 3:15, it says whenever Moses is read, a veil lies before their eyes. Whenever Moses is read, not whenever the Tanakh is read. So if Paul had said something like the law, that is a term that can at times refer to all the scriptures. If you look at John 10:34, Jesus refers to he says your law, and he's citing a psalm. So the term the law, because it's the first part of the three-part series, sometimes it gets shortened. Sometimes it gets shortened to just the law and the prophets. Sometimes it gets shortened all the way to just the law. So the term the law can be used and is sometimes used in the New Testament to refer to either a text anywhere in the Old Testament or to the Old Testament as a whole. It just refers to the whole thing as the law. What never refers to the whole Old Testament is the term Moses. When the term Moses is used, it's always about the actual Torah, the first 5 books, the books of Moses. When it says Moses, anytime in the New Testament, it's either referring to Moses himself, or if it is referring to Moses said or Moses, it's found in Moses, anything like that. When it mentions Moses, it's always mentioning something in those first 5 books. It's never the Old Testament as a whole. So what Tim Hegg says here is from nowhere. There's no support. He's telling us this is the case. It's not the case. So, um, he's denying that that Moses is about just the Torah. But again, I mean, it would be pretty clear if he cited the whole context instead of cutting it off in just that one verse. But I want to let him conclude. So I've got one more citation from this excursus, and then we'll kind of look at the whole thing together because there's already some issues. But let's keep going. It says, Paul goes on in 2 Corinthians 4, 3 through 6 to say, and again, we're reading Hegg, and even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, so that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Messiah, who is the image of God. For we do not preach ourselves, but Messiah Yeshua as Lord, and ourselves as your bondservants for Messiah's sake. For God, who said, Light shall shine out of darkness, is the one who is shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Messiah. 2 Corinthians 4, 3 through 6. Thus, and this is Hegg speaking, in this text, Paul uses old as he does elsewhere, of a life devoid of the Ruach, which is Hebrew for spirit, and therefore a heart or mind which cannot see the glory of Messiah when the Tanakh is read, for it is by the Ruach that Messiah is revealed and received for who he is. End quote. All right. So I chuckle. This is the Hegg thing, the Tim Hegg thing. Thus, when he's speculating, he will often say, "Thus we know," and we don't know everything. Remember, this is all based on a speculation that maybe the author of Hebrews is using these terms new and old the way that Paul does. Maybe. I mean, he gives zero evidence for that, and he hasn't started doing that yet. But he's like, thus we know. No, we don't know. And but this is just I laugh because this is something Hegg does a lot. He writes a theory early on, and you can go back to earlier episodes where we talked about this commentary, and you'll see it there too, where he says, well, we could say this, and then a chapter later he's like, well, since we've clearly shown, it's like, no, you haven't. You just speculated something and then assumed that it was true now, without actually ever giving a biblical case. But anyway, it's funny. All right, there are so many problems. First, we have no indication whatsoever that Paul is using old here when Paul mentions the old covenant. That Paul's using old in the same way in this text as when he speaks of the old man in those other books. Remember, the citations for the old man were from Romans, Ephesians, and Colossians. They weren't in 2 Corinthians. So, yes, Paul, and yes, it's the same author and all of that, but it's a speculation. There's no indication from the text that tells us we know Paul is using the term old covenant the same way he said old man, that an unsaved or unspiritual man. We don't have that indication in this text at all. Also, notice that he jumped from chapter 3 to chapter 4. So again, he skipped over, I'm telling you about, where it says whenever Moses is read. Hegg never mentions that because, again, he's claiming, he's asserting that the Old Covenant equals the Tanakh, equals the whole Old Testament. Whenever the whole Old Testament is read, when anything from the Old Testament is read. But that's not what Paul says. Paul says whenever Moses is read, Moses is the Old Covenant. So Paul is referring to Moses's books as the Old Covenant. What we commonly know of today as the Torah. That's the Old Covenant. It says whenever Moses is read, but of course he skipped that. And we established, and you can check me out on that. Look up Moses in the New Testament. Anytime it's used, it's either talking about the person or it's talking about the books, but it's always Torah. It's never Moses. Moses is not a term that's ever used of any of the other books of the Bible. Hegg he's trying to establish his definition. Remember, we haven't really even gotten to it yet. What he says, he's trying to give you sort of this mishmash of things to try to shore up what he's going to try to argue is the new covenant. Um, but yeah, it's going to be interesting. So he he's trying to establish his definition of what the new covenant is in Hebrews. Remember, we're in the book of Hebrews, but he's doing it via the quote old covenant from Second Corinthians. And that's a huge stretch. The best book to go to in the whole Bible to find out what the new covenant is Hebrews, because it talks about it more than any other book. But instead of looking what Hebrews says about the new covenant, Hegg is looking at what Second Corinthians says about the old covenant. And he's going to try to use that to define the new covenant, to try to tell us what the new covenant is. And that's the stretch. That's a huge stretch. Let's look at these problems kind of in turn. So, Paul refers one time only, as we've talked about, to the old covenant. At no point does Paul make clear that he, in that chapter that we just looked at, that he's using the term old, the same way as when he uses the term old man or the unsaved man without the Spirit. At no point does Paul make that clear that he's saying, I mean the covenant that without the Spirit, or looking at it as an unspiritual person. Like, Paul never says any of that. To be clear, he uses this term old covenant. It's we should define it within its own context. Paul is not clearly making a parallel between when he talks about the old and new man in those other epistles. Um, the subject matter is different. It's not the same thing. Hegg doesn't, and of course, Hegg doesn't give us any evidence that Paul's doing it. He makes up a story about how, well, Paul uses this term old this way. Maybe he's also using this term old the same way when he's talking about a covenant. Again, just like with Hebrews, he's saying maybe. It's all speculation. There's no evidence given. No evidence. The second speculation is that the same thing is happening in Hebrews, right? So that now we can take it from what Paul said about the new and old man in other epistles to what Paul said about the old covenant in Second Corinthians, and then we're going to try to take that and use it as a defining grid when we get to Hebrews, which is actually the book that we should be looking at to define the new covenant. So he avoids, again, citing the text whenever Moses is read. I mentioned this. I just had this in my notes in a different spot. It appears over 80 times. Every time it refers to the Torah. It never refers to the law or the Old Testament in general. He's simply wrong. When he says that he's talking about the Tanakh as the Old Covenant, that's actually just wrong. It's not what's going on. And it's a plain violation of good Bible study. Scripture never defines the new covenant by use of the phrase Old Covenant. Okay, when we're in Hebrews and it's talking about the new covenant and defining it in a lot of different ways, it never defines the term by how the term old covenant and old is used somewhere else. This is something Hegg is doing. Hebrews never does. Scripture nowhere ever does that. The new covenant is defined on different terms. It gives us no warrant to jump over to Paul and to help us define what the new covenant is. It's, like we've mentioned, it's the main subject of several consecutive chapters in Hebrews. It's really quite wild to say we need to go to anywhere else in Paul to help us define the new covenant when it's the main subject of so much of this book. The remainder of the excursus, again, this is Tim Hegg's excursus on what the new covenant is. Defining the new covenant, it continues to expound, but without any further biblical citation, his view of what's happening in 2 Corinthians. So the rest of that excursus, like I said, doesn't mention Hebrews again. It's just about what's going on in 2 Corinthians and what he thinks is happening. And this is sort of where he gets to what he thinks is his conclusion. And this is what his definition is. It says and I'm quoting Tim Hegg again. For Paul, those who read the Tanakh every Shabbat in the synagogue, but did so without the illuminating work of the Spirit, were reading an, quote, Old Covenant, That is, the covenant which by itself is powerless to save. If the Spirit of God does not illumine the eyes of faith to the truth of the Scriptures, then the Scriptures are simply letters upon parchment, letters engraved on stone, rather than written on the heart. In short, then, Old Covenant is not to be identified with the Torah of Moses, even though Moses is what it says in the text, or the so-called, sorry, that was my own little aside. It is not, to quote him, it is not to be identified with the Torah of Moses or the so-called, quote, Old Testament, nor is the, quote, New Covenant to be viewed as the so-called New Testament. Rather, as our author shows clearly, the contrast is between righteousness granted by God through faith in his Messiah, New Covenant, in parentheses, as over against relying on one's people group status as counting for righteousness in God's eyes, Old Covenant. So you see what Tim Hegg is doing here. He's saying that really we're not talking about the Sinai covenant and the covenant established by Jesus. Rather, we're talking about reading the Bible, any of the Bible, through faith and with the Spirit. That's the new covenant. And anytime you do it without that, that's the old covenant. If that seems odd and unique and you never heard that before, you'd be just like me the first time that I heard this stuff. I want to point out one other little point that I don't know if I wrote it in any of my notes, but it occurred to me as I was reviewing my notes that he says that the Tanakh, there in that first line, it couldn't lead people to Christ, and I just think that's hilarious because Jesus says, if you believe Moses, you would believe me. Like the if you read the Old Testament and if you read the scriptures, and that's another way he puts it. He says if you read and understood the scriptures, you would understand that they're speaking of me. So they do lead people to Christ when they're believed. So I don't know. It's a awkward way he puts things, but that's an aside. The main issue here is his unique take on what is new and old covenant. It's not two separate covenants God made at two separate times in history. No, old covenant is just it's a disposition. It's a disposition of thinking that it's your people group and not really having faith in Christ and reading the scriptures versus having faith and the illuminating work of the Spirit and reading the same scriptures. That's the difference between old covenant and new covenant, according to Tim Hegg. And he's tried to kind of massage that into being by talking about how the old man is the unspiritual, the unsaved man, and the new man is the saved man. And then we're going to transfer that old and new into talking about old and new covenant. And then we're going to try to take that and now insert it into Hebrews. That's kind of what's going on here. So, and as usual, he's very overconfident. This has all been based on speculation. This has not been based on um, anything in the text, as we've seen. He's not argued for any of this stuff based on what the text actually teaches us. He's just speculating about the use of certain words. He says, our author, and notice what he says there at the end. Our author shows clearly that Hegg's view is correct, and of course that is false. This is Hegg's method, where he speculates about something, then talks about it for at length, and then at the end talks about how his conclusion is clear and in the text when it never was in the text. He says our author is the author of Hebrews. The entire paragraph is about 2 Corinthians. Let me remind you, we're talking about this clearly stuff. He says, in short, then, where is it? Old covenant is not to be identified, rather as our author shows clearly. Our author is the author of Hebrews. He hasn't talked about Hebrews. He's been talking about Paul. He's been talking about 2 Corinthians. But now he's just saying, as our author, our Hebrews author shows clearly, the contrast is between righteousness granted by God through faith in his Messiah, that's the new covenant, over against relying on a people group status. And that's the old covenant. He has not established that. He hasn't even tried to establish that. He's been talking about Paul and Second Corinthians. And now he's just drawing a conclusion about Hebrews with zero reference to Hebrews. That's why I say he's very, very overconfident here. He stopped talking about Hebrews some time ago, long time ago in the excursus. Early on, he stops talking about Hebrews and is just talking about Second Corinthians. But he still thinks that he can say that Hebrews shows clearly that the distinction between the Old and New Covenants isn't actually covenants, but it's the state of faith of a person reading the Scriptures. And again, that was nowhere in the text. That's a, a speculative, jumping around in different texts. What is actually clear is he's not allowing the text to just speak on its own terms. In the entire excursus on the New Covenant, he never allows the clear contrast drawn in the book of Hebrews to inform his theological conclusions. He didn't deal with Hebrews at all. He dealt with other stuff, and didn't really even deal with that stuff. He just created a theory based on it. And ask yourself, should we base our understanding of the phrase New Covenant in Hebrews, should we base our understanding on a highly speculative theory about a different phrase in a different book, or how the phrase itself is used in its own context, which is all I've done this entire series, is look at the phrase as it appears in the text of Hebrews. That's what Hegg doesn't do. That's what he avoids doing. All right, let's jump back into chapter 9. And before we do, let me take a look. I've seen, in the corner of my eye, we've got some stuff going on in the chat. Uh, Gloria says he's trying to get into the mind of the writer. He's psychologizing the writer, which is a huge red flag since you can't read minds. I agree with that. Um, uh, does Tim hold the writer of Hebrews is Paul? It doesn't sound like it. I don't, if I remember right, I don't think he thinks that. Um, I would, there's so many theories on that, and I'm not going to pretend I have any idea. There's obvious connections to Paul. I think the best theory going is that um, it is a sermon that was probably preached more than once by Paul, but written down by Luke. Luke when he traveled with Paul. That's it's a one of the theories that's out there, and it's the one that's most appealing to me. But I don't pretend to really know. Um, the point that I would make is that you just can't go and cause highly speculative theories about things in Paul and take those highly speculative theories and use them as an interpretive grid to force a certain meaning onto Hebrews, especially when Hebrews is actually the text that gives you the most detail about the subject at hand. That's the important bit. Um, then let's see. Professor Hive says, "What about Acts 15:21? The use of Moses." It says Moses is read in the synagogues. Absolutely, yeah, Moses, the Torah, the law, um, the actual stuff written by Moses. There's no indication it's talking about anything else. Obviously, the rest of the Tanakh also is read in the synagogues, but there's no indications from Hebrews 15, or from Acts 15 that it means that it's definitely referring to those other books, like you can do with the term law. You can take the term law and find places where it's clearly citing stuff outside of the Pentateuch, outside of the first 5 books. You cannot do that with the word Moses. You just can't do it. You can speculate, maybe, but there's no clear example. Um, uh, Professor Hive says he may have just been presupposing and stating his conclusions in a short manner to make a point, just to be fair to Tim. Well, I mean, I've read a lot of Tim's works, and what I'm giving you is textbook Tim Hegg. It is how he does it. I'm sure I have plans in the future to talk about his commentary on the book of Galatians, and it's the same story there. It's I mean, when you're writing, the thing is, yeah, no matter what you do, there's certain limitations for space and things like that. But I've not only read this excursus on the New Covenant, I've also listened to Tim Hegg's um, like is at least two part or at least two, maybe more part um like talk that he gave where he that's all it was just let's talk about what's the new covenant. And it's the same thing. It's the same basic argument. The fact that and I assume you follow him and you know this stuff because you brought up 2 Corinthians 3:14 in the chat before I got to that part. And so I assume you're well aware of his views. And it's always the same. It's the same sort of speculative talk about what Paul meant by old and new man being applied to old covenant and then taking that and applying it to Hebrews. There's no warrant to do any of that. It's all speculation. And he doesn't use Hebrews to define any of it when again that's the main text. Um, and he says, yeah, I don't think Tim Hegg is far off from Christian theology when he says you need to read the scriptures via the Spirit to be saved. This is a Calvinist position that God must draw us near to believe. I don't disagree with that either. But again, the fact that as if you believe, and I agree, I'm a Calvinist too. I think that we can't truly understand, we can't truly believe the scriptures without the illumining work of the Spirit. That's all true. That doesn't make that doesn't mean that that's what the new covenant is. That's an aspect of salvation, but that doesn't mean that that's what the author of Hebrews is talking about when he talks about the new covenant. The new covenant was inaugurated with the blood of Christ. It happened in history, just like the Sinai covenant happened in history. That's really what's going on. So yeah, you can say a true thing about theology, but that doesn't mean that that thing applies to the text you're looking at. Um, the way that you say it does. And that's where Hegg is highly speculating on what these terms mean. And he's not actually getting this stuff from the text. So let's keep going. We're done with the excursus, now back into Hebrews 9. But again, talking about some of the things from his commentary on Hebrews 9. So the next section is verses 16 and 17. Um, he expends a lot of energy here in another excursus about that this is not actually about a last will and testament, but it's still about a regular covenant. I'm not really going to deal with that a lot, but I want to point out one obviously wrong thing he does in that excursus when he tries to, again, cram priesthood in where it doesn't exist. Um, so Hegg disagrees with my view and the most common view that when it talks about a covenant is not in effect until the one who made it dies, and that this is actually about a certain kind of covenant, a last will and testament kind of covenant. And Hegg says, no, it's not that. It's just a regular covenant. It's honestly a lot of, he expends a lot of energy, like I said, but it doesn't really matter that much. But I do want to mention something he says in that excursus about the priesthood. So this is this is from his commentary quoting Tim Hegg. It says, in explaining why it was necessary for Messiah, verses 16 and 17, to die in order to qualify as the mediator of the new covenant, our author makes several points. One, a covenant ratification ceremony requires death. And two, a covenant is not valid until a death occurs. He then goes on to show that these principles were illustrated by and shown to be true in the first covenant, verses 18 through 22. That is in the Sinai covenant, which gave specific instructions regarding the priesthood and the service of sacrifices. So, up until that very last sentence, I agree. You know, he's just talking about how Jesus had to die because establishing covenants requires death. Especially these kind of bigger ones. Um, we see it with Abraham's covenant. We see it with the Sinai covenant. We see it with the new covenant. There's a death. Totally agree. The covenant ratification requires death. That's when it's ratified. That's when it really takes effect. and it's not valid until that point. That's all true, but then it's this last sentence that is absolutely false. He says, that is, in the Sinai covenant, which gave specific instructions regarding the priesthood and the service of sacrifices. See, he wants to make Hebrews a contrast between priesthoods when he really has no justification for doing so. And this statement is false when it comes to what's being said here about the death and you know, the Moses sprinkling the blood, all that stuff, that is somehow regarding the priesthood and service of sacrifices. It's just not true, as we're going to see. Because neither this passage nor the passage in Exodus, so it's quoting from Exodus, neither one of those is, which, that the passage in Exodus is about the inauguration, the ratification of the Sinai covenant. Neither one ever mentions or discusses the priesthood. Neither Hebrews nor Exodus talks about the priests or their service of sacrifices at all. There's blood, there's a death, but it is not about those sacrifices. The Moses, though he was a Levite, he was from the tribe of Levi, just like Aaron, his brother, who was the high priest. Moses himself was not a part of the priesthood. This text is clearly about the beginning of the Sinai covenant, the ratification. Just like Tim Hegg said, it's the one, and it is about the Sinai covenant, the old covenant, right? I mean, it doesn't use that phrase, right? But it calls it the first covenant. It is about that covenant, and it's the same one that has been repeatedly compared and contrasted with the new covenant. Again, this text is clearly about covenants. It's not about priesthoods. Tim Hegg is just inserting that because he wants that. That's what he wants it to be about. But the text itself is not about the priesthood when it's talking about the death and need for death. The need for death is for ratification of the covenant. When the animals died for the Abrahamic covenant, when the animals died that Moses sprinkled the blood from, it's about the ratification of the covenant. It's not about the Levitical priesthood work and the service of sacrifices, as Hegg says. That's nowhere in the text. He's just adding it. That is what it comes down to. His commentary doesn't really offer anything else to challenge what I pointed out here in chapter 9. So, we've talked about chapter 9 where we've come to the end, started at the beginning. Nothing else in the commentary really challenges anything else and anything that we've talked about the clear parallel between the new covenant and first covenant that we saw there in verse 15, and we see again here in verses 18, 19. Those parallels are constant throughout this entire section, and nothing else that he said here in this section really challenges that. So, I've dealt with, obviously I didn't quote the whole commentary, but I quoted everything that he said that challenges sort of the mainstream view, and we've seen that pretty much everything is speculative and just jumping to other texts and really running away from what Hebrews itself says. So next time we will talk about chapter 10, which is probably my favorite chapter. If I had to pick a favorite chapter in Hebrews, um, chapter 10 is absolutely amazing. It's so good. Um, and we're gonna see some fireworks there in chapter 10. So, um, does anybody have any questions? I know y'all have been awesome. So I appreciate Gloria and Professor Hives in there uh, commenting on what we've been talking about. But does anybody have any specific thoughts or questions based on that last section or anything we've discussed? Um, even earlier on in the show, talking about the false accusations of that I only deal with the surface level stuff, and I never get it deep into what the real scholars have to say, I guess. Um, but We'll oh, it looks like I said deep dive 6 on this slide because I didn't change that. It is 7. All right. Okay. Comment from my lovely wife. You look and sound great. Thank you, honey. You do too. Um, what would you say if Tim's understanding of Old Covenant is what is passing away in Hebrews 8:13? Because passing away seems to parallel Moses' glory fading. Um, oh, I think there's definitely a parallel there between the Old Covenant, the glory of that covenant, the stuff about the veil in, you know, in Paul when he's talking about the Old Covenant. He's talking about Moses. He's actually talking about the Torah, the law, when that's read and the veil and that's passing away and the glory is fading away. I think that's all good, but I think that Paul's using the term Old Covenant. I think he's referring to the same thing that the Hebrews author is referring to. I think he is. I think they're both referring to the Sinai covenant, to the covenant made with the people of Israel at Sinai, written down for us in the first, large chunk of the first 5 books of Moses. Um, but Tim's understanding of what the Old Covenant is not to be found in any of that. His understanding that Old Covenant means reading the text without the illumination of the Spirit. That's not what the text says. The text is about that Christ removes the veil. Christ removes that veiling, from that Old Covenant. The Old Covenant, as Hebrews 8 makes absolutely clear, is passing away. So, um, yeah. So I think there are related topics, but I do not think that you can define the New and Old Covenant as just reading the law with or without the Spirit the way Tim Hegg does. There's just nothing. It's nowhere in Scripture. It's just not found. Um, Professor Hives, again, thank you for answering. I might ask one unrelated question. Why do you think James told Paul to help men with their Nazarite vow to he live prove he lives sin and lives in, it says live sin observance, but I think you meant lives in observance of the law in Acts 21:24. Well, for that, I would refer you to, I'll give you an answer here. But I would also refer you, if you want a fuller answer, my series Torah Under Christ. I recommend the whole thing, that 5.5 hour long behemoth of 3 videos. But I would recommend in part 3, there's a section about that chapter, about Acts 21 and what's going on there. It doesn't say so here's, I'll try to give it to you in a nutshell, and hopefully this helps. So when James shows up, actually, let's go ahead. Let me pull up the the text itself, because I think this really helps. Acts 21, and let's go here and show this off. And I'm gonna, what, I didn't really, whatever. It's all good. Okay, so all right. So the relevant section that we're looking at is in Jerusalem. All right. I want you to what's actually in the text is key, and a lot of times people just gloss over it. I think this is one of the better texts to show us an actual misunderstanding of Paul, but it has nothing to do with it does not help the Torah observance view at all. So Um, in verse, let's see, in verse 9, so Paul went with us to James, verse 18. All the elders were present, and after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God did among the Gentiles through his ministries. When they heard it, they began glorifying God and said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews." All right. Um, all right. So, okay, let me start that verse. So you see, brother, so they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you," listen closely, "they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you've come. Therefore, do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Then all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should keep from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took the men the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification, until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. Okay, so what is going on in this text? Um, the first thing to notice, this is the really the really important thing is, what is it that Paul is being accused of? There's a parallel, I think. If you look through Paul's epistles, you'll see that this is in parallel with a lot of the things Paul says in his epistles. Um, Paul is accused, because Paul defends himself in a lot of his epistles, and he'll say things because he knows what people will say in response when he talks about the free and the gospel of grace and salvation by grace through faith and not of works and all this stuff. He says on several occasions, something along the lines of, "Shall we sin so that grace may abound, or can we just live any way we want?" He says, "May it never be." Um, and there's this sense in which Paul is so excited about and teaching this gospel of grace that it's very easy for people to accuse him of telling them that they can just do whatever they want, right? But not just, and there's no obedience at all. And this is kind of what I was relating to when I was saying that it's a slander of Christians for people to call us antinomian who aren't Torah observant, because that is not what that word means. That word means like no law. It means that we don't have to obey God, but that's not what Christians have traditionally believed. We disagree about certain aspects of the law given to Moses, but we don't think that we don't have to obey God. We're not antinomian. But the point I would make, the thing I would say here is, this is a good example of something where Paul's being accused of something, again, related to the law, just like and related to obeying God. But look at what it says he's accused of. It says, "They have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses." So first of all, it's what he's teaching Jews that he's accused about. It has nothing to do with the Gentiles. He's not being accused of anything regarding what he teaches Gentiles. So if he were teaching the traditional Christian view that Gentiles don't have to adopt all the laws given to Moses under the Sinai covenant, that's not what's even under discussion here. It's not about what he teaches Gentiles. In fact, it goes on at the end to say, about the Gentiles, we have these 4 instructions, and those are good. Um, but look at what it's saying he's teaching Jews. It says they're accusing him of teaching Jews not only what Christians have believed throughout history, church, that it's okay. Like if you wanna, eat kosher, knock yourself out. It's not a sin to do the things in the Torah. It's it's a s- it, But the things that are that no longer apply the same way in the new covenant, it's not a sin either way. You can do it or not do it. It's a question of, you know, conscience, but what that's not what this is about. This is about Paul positively teaching Jews to not circumcise their children, that it's wrong. Don't do it. Forsake Moses, don't circumcise. Look what it says, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. This is not just telling them, hey, it's okay, you know, new covenant now, you don't have to. No, what he's being accused of is telling them not to do it anymore, telling Jews not to do the things in the law anymore. It's a positive teaching forbidding the keeping of the law that that Paul is being accused of. And we know this two ways. Number one, it just explicitly says it, but we also know it because of what James tells Paul to do. Because remember that the debate we're talking about is the debate about whether certain aspects of the law are required or just, not required. If something's not required, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means you don't have to do it. There's in all, and this is just normal ethics 101, that when it comes to all of our behavior, everything, if we hold to any kind of a moral standard, we have things we think are required of us. We have things that we think on the other side are forbidden for us. We can't do them. And then there's a lot of stuff in the middle that's just permitted to us, and they're not required, they're not forbidden. It's not required or forbidden to get married. It's not required or forbidden to have children. It is now it's part of our nature, and there are good things about getting married and there are good things about not getting married. Um, but it's not the same thing. But the point I'm making is read the text. The text is about Paul forbidding them to keep the law. Now here is why James's instruction to him fits that idea and not the debate we're having, which is whether these things are required or not required. We're not even talking about if they're forbidden, because the solution is not for Paul to go out and tell people, hey, no, 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 I'm not teaching that. That's not the solution. The solution is for Paul to go do something commanded in the law, to go and pay these guys expenses and purify himself and go through this ritual. I'm not convinced he actually offers any sacrifices in the text. He tells about a time of purification when sacrifices were going to be offered, but he at least goes through the ritual with them and all this stuff related to the temple. Now, if the debate was our modern debate where it's just about whether these things are required or just okay to do and okay not to do, if that was the real debate, him doing it wouldn't prove anything. It would just show, well, yeah, that's, he thinks it's okay to do it. It doesn't prove anything against what he's being accused of. But because that's not what he's being accused of, he's being accused of teaching Jews to stop doing the law, that it's wrong to keep doing the law. For him to go do something in the law proves that accusation false. That's why James's his instruction fits perfectly with what Paul is actually being accused of. So that's why I don't think this text in any way establishes that Paul is, you know, that his theology matches up with modern day Torah observance at all. Paul is being accused of telling Jews to stop keeping the law, that God wants them to quit it. And that is not what he's teaching. And he goes about doing the the purification stuff, and it that proves the lie. It proves that he can't be teaching people to stop doing it when he's willing to do it. Clearly, that's not what he's telling them. And again, it's not even about the Gentiles. It's not even about whether the Gentiles are being required to do these things that Gentiles were never required to do um, before this. So I hope that kind of makes sense and helps. Let's see. You yourself. So what about the meaning of that you yourself also, meaning like Jews zealous for the law, walk orderly, keeping the law? Yeah, I mean, what again, what does that mean? You know, he's a Jew living at during this generation when the law is still, the temple sacrifice is still going. Everything's still happening according to the Old Testament. And there's no point where God commands, again, this is the accusation that's being leveled against Paul. There's no point where God tells the Jews, "Hey, quit it. You know, stop it." You know, that doesn't happen. Rather, what happens is God himself just demolishes the entire system by destroying the temple and the city. So it's it, there's no place where God tells Jews to stop, but that isn't even the debate. The debate we're having today is whether that the laws under that covenant ever got expanded to Gentiles, which they never did. There's no text that ever says they did. And they were clearly for the people in that covenant. They were not for all the nations. No other nation is ever judged for not keeping the Sabbath or not eating kosher or not keeping those feasts. I mean, those were all related specifically to the nation of Israel under the Sinai covenant. So in terms of Gentiles, now Gentiles are judged for lots of other things. The Gentile nations in the Old Testament are judged for all kinds of, shedding of innocent blood and injustice and all that kind of stuff and pride. But they're not ever judged for these specific covenantally tied commandments because those weren't given to them. And so in the New Testament, when Jesus comes and then the gospel and the new covenant is being expanded to all the nations, at no point did those laws get expanded to all the nations. And from what we see in Hebrews and other places, we see that even though it's okay, no one ever forbids them to keep doing those things. They they keep they can do them if they want. It's they still don't they actually don't have to. And that's kind of what Hebrews is getting at. I think is like, you know, don't worry about those sacrifices. You have Jesus. That you have the once for all sacrifice. In fact, as we're going to see when we talk about chapter 10, if those sacrifices could do, what anything, that Jesus did, if they could really take away sins, they would have ceased. They would have stopped. The whole reason they don't stop or haven't stopped is because of the sin issue still being there. So the the question is, and again, the one way that you have to also kind of understand, I think one thing that's going on too is it's not a question of the law going away. At no point in any of this have I said anything about the law is done. No, the covenant is done. God's law is in scripture is spoken of in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's about, the universal, never changing aspects of what God, obligates men to do. And that have never changed, and they weren't tied to any covenant. And those that's God's law too. That's properly understood to be God's law. Um, but when he's talking about that you walk orderly, keeping the law, that you do these things, which contradicts the idea that you would be forbidding them of others. I think that's the context of the the chapter there. So hope that makes sense. Um, let's see. Gloria says Paul didn't see himself as a convert to Christianity as far as he was concerned. He lived all his life as a faithful Pharisee. I don't know. I think he did believe he was, you know, he was converted to Christ. That is pretty clear. Um, and then let's see, Professor Hives again. I think Andrew believes that he breaks the law under some circumstances because 1 Corinthians 9. So he doesn't live in observance of the law. I'm curious about Andrew's response. So I think he's not breaking anything. Again, it depends on how you're looking at it. If Torah observance theology were true, he would be breaking laws. When he says that I live, like one under the law or like one not under the law in 1 Corinthians 9, it's not that he's breaking any law. He's not under certain law, but he is. But as I've said, and as Christians have always said, he doesn't think himself not under any law. He thinks himself under the law of Christ, which I've argued, to just kind of try to summarize it real fast, is I do believe in the distinctions of types of law in the Bible. There's moral law, there's ceremonial law, there's civil law. I don't think that those distinctions exist only to say, well, therefore we're not under stuff except for the moral law. I don't think that's what they are. I think ceremonial laws are tied to the covenant. Civil laws are tied to the nation, but they may or may not, they may still have moral application for us today, but just in different ways because we're under a different covenant. But the ceremonial laws are laws tied to a covenant. I think Christians today are under ceremonial law, just not that it's different covenant. We're under the law that says that we, take the Lord's Supper and that we baptize believers and that we make disciples of all nations and that we appoint elders in the churches and we don't forsake the gathering. And there's a bunch of different things. There's a lot of stuff in the New Testament that I think are ceremonial laws for the new covenant. We offer a sacrifice of praise. These things are not things that the heathen, the unbeliever, are not doing, and therefore they're judged for. Just like the other nations are not judged for breaking ceremonial laws given through Moses. The unbelievers in the world, they're guilty of all kinds of sin because of moral law, but they're not guilty of breaking the law of not getting baptized or something because they're not believers. God didn't give them that commandment. God, if once they become believers and once they become members of the new covenant, now they're obligated to the ceremonial laws of the covenant. So that's, but law doesn't just go away because of the new covenant. Law is still there, but it's just not the law specific to that covenant. And it's not that it's not there anymore. It's just that we aren't obligated to it in the same way. We still see it as scripture. We still learn from it. It still edifies us. It just isn't an obligation for us the same way it was for them. All right, y'all. I think we've been going a little over 2 hours, and that's about what I was thinking it would take tonight. So I really appreciate you guys being here and good questions. I appreciate you being here, Professor Hives. I don't know you by any other name, so maybe I know you another name another way, but in another place. But I appreciate you guys, and I am going to be hopefully doing this again fairly soon. Getting into Hebrews 10 again. It's like my favorite chapter. But anyway, thank you so much once again for being here, and I pray that your evening is blessed. And feel free to reach out anytime. Watch Torah Under Christ if you haven't. Really understand, I'm not taking this stuff lightly, and